In this video, we're going to talk about animal behavior. And as we go through this video, I really want you to think about how does animal behavior and natural selection, what is the relationship between the two of those? So to start off with a little bit of background information, ethology is the study of behavior and its evolution. And so this is where I really want you to start thinking about that natural selection. Here are three scientists who were awarded the Nobel Prize and really founders of this field. You have Carl von Frisch, which he did some research with honeybees and something called the waggle dance. And what's pretty cool here is you can see a little diagram here, but essentially it's the way that bees attract other bees when they find food to come. So they recruit other members to come and help them bring the food back to where they need it. So it's actually like a roadmap they use. Nico Tinbergen, he discovered this idea of a fixed action pattern, which we'll talk about in just a minute. And then Konrad Lorenz, you've probably heard of. He did a lot with imprinting, or you may be familiar with him having a line of geese follow behind him. So what is a fixed action pattern? This is an innate behavior, meaning that the organism or animals are born with knowing how to do this. It's an unchanging behavioral response. In other words, it's anything that's going to be continued to completion, no matter how useless it might be. And it's elicited by something called a sign stimulus. And the sign stimulus is just a trigger in the environment. And so the best example of a fixed action pattern is when you're looking at male sticklebacks. And so male sticklebacks are very territorial, and they're going to defend that territory against other males. And in this example, the red belly is a trigger, or that's the sign stimulus. And so what scientists did was they actually put little models or wood blocks, one that had a red underbelly, and they saw that the male stickleback would always attack that wooden block. It was useless to do that because the wooden block was not going to take over its territory, but that was just a stimulus there. They did this and they compared it to one piece of wood that had like a swollen belly to simulate a female, and they found that there was no attack. Rather, there was a mating ritual that occurred. And so fixed action pattern, continue to completion all the time. This should be a pretty quick review from bio. We're not going to spend too much time on it. There are innate and learned behaviors. Innate behaviors are behaviors that animals are born with, knowing how to do, and learned are gained through experience. And so very quickly, there are 6 innate behaviors. You have a reflex, courtship, so involved in mating, territoriality, which is defending one's territory, suckling, especially in mammals. When they're born, they go to their mother to find milk and food. Aggressive, this is also known as agnostic behavior, so aggressive behaviors. And then there's some yearly and seasonal innate behaviors, so things like migration, hibernation, so in extreme cold, shutting down metabolic processes. And the opposite of hibernation, estivation, which is in extreme heat, shutting down some of those metabolic processes. Examples of learned behavior: habituation, imprinting, trial and error, conditioning, insight, and communication. We're going to focus a little bit on the learned behaviors. So on the left here, what you can see is a diagram of Lorenz, that guy who studied a little bit of imprinting. And what he has is he has a line of geese following him. And so what he did was experiments where he would hatch geese, and those geese would imprint onto him, meaning that they would start following the very first thing they saw, or they would associate him as mom. And so everywhere that he went, they literally would follow him around. And so he's a founder of that field. Over here, what you can see is a graph. You have a strength of the response, and in this example, maybe it's the time a snail spends withdrawn in a shell. And along your x-axis, you have shell taps. And so what happens is, as the number of times that the stimulus or the taps is given, you can see that the strength of the response goes down, or that the time it spends in its shell goes down. What has happened is the snail has gotten used to the response. This is habituation. It's when an organism becomes used to a certain stimulus and it doesn't really respond to that anymore. And so make sure that you can kind of depict this graph with habituation. Going a little bit more into learned behaviors or associative learning On the left here, you have something called classical condition. This was developed by this guy named Pavlov. You may have heard of Pavlov's dog. And so what he did was he had an unconditioned stimulus, food, and the dog would salivate. What he essentially started doing was he would ring a bell, give the dog food, and he would see that the dog would start salivating. Well, over time, after conditioning that dog, eventually he could just take away the food, ring the bell, and the dog would start salivating. That's an example of classical conditioning or learned behavior. The dog associates the bell with food, which means salivation. Kind of the opposite of this, which was discovered or studied by a guy named B.F. Skinner, was this idea of operant conditioning. This is also known as that trial and error. And he studied this with rats. So what he did was he put rats in a maze, and when the rat would accidentally pull a lever, it was awarded food. And so over time, what would happen is that the rat would learn, okay, if I pull this lever, I get food. And so that's another example of associative learning. And then the last thing that we really need to talk about here is something called altruism. And this is a pretty interesting behavior that animals exhibit. This is a behavior that reduces an individual's reproductive fitness, but it increases the fitness of the colony or of other members of the same species. It's also known as kin selection or inclusive fitness. This is pretty common in bees. So for example, those worker bees, if something is attacking a hive, they will actually sacrifice themselves for the other individuals. And there is a genetic basis to this as well. And so overall, what I want you to take from this video are the different types of behavior, some of the different terms that we defined, but I really want you to be able to answer the question, how would natural selection and animal behavior coincide? You should come to the conclusion that natural selection is going to favor those behaviors that increase reproductive fitness, right? Because organisms that are most fit will survive and reproduce.